Anarchy came on. And the only reason that the United States is interested in what's going on in Somalia today is because it might be a threat to the interest of the United States. In Somalia, being an anarchy, a place with no government, where people of all deviant behavior can group and regroup, the United States, having had the experience with Afghanistan and the Taliban, want to prevent, and particularly the Bush administration wants to prevent that such islands of terrorism can arise. Now, there are two ways of going about it. One way is, let's ignore this place, let them sort out their business, and we'll see what they make of it. If they want to go through centuries of medieval treatment and they want to go back with the Islamic courts to the 7th century, fine. I don't really think that many Americans care beyond caring in the moral sense. Like, people would say it's terrible what's happening there, but they would never put policy and money and American lives to go out there and do it. One, and I would say in the international, in theory on international relations, one of them that is emerging, and I think what we still see as people being called the neoconservatives, is if America interferes at all, then it should not only be about the American interest. You can put a moral, a moral mortgage on things by saying, look, we are going to improve things. We are not going to leave Afghanistan without a government. We are going to put in a government there to prevent, we're going to bring in democracy, we're going to prevent Al-Qaeda-like and other terrorists from making their home. That's not what is happening in Somalia today. What is happening in Somalia today is we see people reverting back to the old theory of having a neighboring country or a force within the place, within Somalia, and trying to remove the bad guys. So America will finance them and will help them and so on, and then hopefully waiting until the problem solves itself. Now, we've seen that in many countries that hasn't worked. And I don't think it's going to work at all. And it's not about Somalis and Ethiopians hating each other. It's about Ethiopia being a dictatorship, Ethiopia being bad for its own people, and Ethiopia will maybe send the troops under pressure from the United States for now, but that is never going to be long-lasting. And the Somali, well, what? The alternative, they call themselves the secular movement, who want to oust the Islamic courts. They're not dedicated to the American interest of establishing a democracy and establishing the rule of law and so on and so forth. They just want to take the money for a while, use it, and then see what happens next. This is a place where we live by the day. We don't have long future plans on building democracies and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry to disappoint all of you. The new, reverting back to the old policy of helping the bad guy to serve the interests of the United States is not going to help. It's only going to postpone a problem and make it bigger and worse.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Abdurrahim Fukara. I'm from Al Jazeera Television here in Washington. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on both the book and your personal courage. Secondly, if you'll allow me a little prologue before I ask you my question. I, much like yourself, was born in Africa. I was born in Morocco and emigrated to Europe, where I spent 14 wonderful years in the UK before I moved to the United States, where I've been here for about 7-8 years now. And despite the implications of 9/11 for both Americans and Muslims living in the United States, I think that the United States remains a great host for Muslims, many of whom, by the way, may agree with some of your criticisms of Muslim society. My question is, what are in your eyes the major defects of the West? And a second question about immigration. What do you see as the fundamental difference between Muslim immigrants from Africa integrating or trying to integrate into Europe and Christian African immigrants trying to integrate into European society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The major and most important defect I see among if you ask me, I mean, and you're asking me to grossly generalize, let me do that, because it doesn't hold on for everyone. But that is to say, the West has come to regard the values of freedom, the yardstick of human rights, as something Western. Many of them, especially in Europe, take the values and the institutions of freedom, the institutions on science, freedom, curiosity, the individual, rule of law, they've come to take that so for granted that they're either not aware of the threat against it, they're not aware of the fact that you have to be, sustain it day by day, as is with all man-made things. I mean, if this building, the roof will leak and the paint will fall and you have to repaint it, you have to maintain it all the time. It seems that people have forgotten that. And perhaps part of the reason is because the generation that's now enjoying all the freedoms in the West is not the generations that built it. These are generations that inherited it. And like companies, family companies, often you'll see, for those of you who are interested in economics, the first generation and the second generation are almost always more passionate about the brand and the family company and keeping it all in the family. And then the third generation live, use, take the money, and they're either overtaken by bigger companies, swallowed up, or they go bankrupt. And I think that there is an analogy there in that the generations after the Second World War living today in Europe, United States may be different, but I'm here much too short to say anything about that, is that there are people who are so complacent, they've always been free, they just no longer know what it is, what freedom costs. That might be, I think, for me, that would be making the big mistake. And you can see it by look at the education systems in Europe. History is no longer an obligatory subject. Science is no longer an obligatory subject. School systems have become about, look at Holland, our country, where they have allowed parents to be, in the name of freedom, to build their own schools, that we now have schools founded on what the child wants. So if the child wants to play all day long, then that is an individual freedom of the child. And so it's up to the child to decide whether to do math or to play. and in our country, in Holland, in the name of freedom of education, the state pays for these schools. And I was raving against Muslim schools. And I thought about these schools and I was like, okay, in Muslim schools, at least they learn to count, It's all relative. So there's a bit of that. And then is there a difference between, for example, Christian Africans and Muslim Africans? And I want to expand on that and say, if you look at the UK, for example, is there a difference between Indians and Pakistanis? Is there a difference about Ismaili Muslims and Sunni Muslims? And what we see often, again and again, is that the tribalism, because tribalism is something which I think almost all third world populations have not really dealt with properly, is when they come in, you have the usual obstacles to integration. You want to be with your family, you want to stick with people with whom you speak the same language, there's the need to help others and so on. And that's what we see with Christian Africans. There are difficulties with integration until the second generation or the third generation, and then somehow they seem to disappear. We've seen it in Holland with the Surinams coming from, not Africa, but from the former colony of Suriname, where the first generation was extremely difficult, lots of clashes, but now in terms of education and in terms of labor, on the labor market, they perform just as highly as the native populations or just as lowly. With the Muslim populations, it seems to be increasingly, it seems as if the parents were more integrated than the second generation, as if the second generation is doing better than the third generation. And again, we can't overlook this, but there's still kids who grow up in Holland or in France or in the UK, who speak the language, who understand the system, who are eloquent on it, and who say, I know what democracy is, I know what the rule of law is, but I don't want any part of it. I want